On a sweltering August afternoon in the small lakeside town of Briar Ridge, the regular lunch crowd was starting to trickle into the Pinecrest Diner, unaware that something extraordinary was about to unfold. To the customers, the tall, unshaven man lingering near the corner booth looked like just another drifter passing through, perhaps someone down on his luck. The restaurant manager certainly thought so, and his voice carried an edge of disdain as he moved to escort the man outside. What no one in the diner realized was that the homeless stranger had once commanded missions in places most people couldn't find on a map. And within the hour, a Black Hawk helicopter would descend into the parking lot, changing the lives of everyone in that restaurant forever. But before the roar of rotor blades shook the windows, before stunned faces turned toward the sky, the day began in the most unassuming way possible. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Pinecrest Diner had always been the kind of place where locals went for comfort food and a bit of gossip. Tucked beside the main road and backed by the sprawling green hills that led down to Lake Belmore, it was a haven for truckers, retirees, and weekend tourists. Its vinyl booths squeaked when you sat down, the scent of coffee clung to the air, and a faded mural of the lake stretched across the back wall. The manager, a man named Kyle Foster, was a stickler for keeping the place presentable. He prided himself on maintaining order, which to him meant everyone looking and behaving the part of respectable customers. When he spotted the man in the corner booth, dusty boots, worn jacket, duffel bag at his feet, Kyle's lips tightened. He didn't recognize the face, and in a town where everyone knew everyone, that was enough to raise suspicion. From his booth, the stranger was quiet, almost too quiet. His posture was relaxed but deliberate, eyes scanning the diner not with idle curiosity, but with the subtle precision of someone taking in every detail without moving his head much. A mother trying to wrangle her two kids, the teenager in an apron fumbling with a tray, the window that wouldn't shut properly by the door, all noted in passing. He asked for a glass of water when the waitress approached, his voice low and calm, but there was a weight to it that made her pause for a second before heading back to the counter. Kyle, however, wasn't pausing. He had seen enough to make up his mind. The man didn't fit the polished image Kyle wanted for his diner, especially with the summer tourists who brought in good money. That morning, the diner had already been buzzing with talk of the upcoming county fair and a fishing competition on the lake. The air was thick with heat, the fans overhead turning lazily. Out on the street, the sound of a delivery truck idling mixed with the chatter of the lunch crowd inside. It was just another day until Kyle strode across the floor, arms folded, eyes narrowing on the corner booth. The waitress barely had time to set down the water before Kyle was there, leaning in with a voice just loud enough for others to hear, telling the man that loiterers weren't welcome, that this wasn't a shelter, and that he needed to move along. A few customers glanced over, curious, but not trying to be obvious. The stranger didn't argue. He simply looked up at Kyle, his expression unreadable, and slowly slid out of the booth. He left a few crumpled bills on the table, enough to cover coffee and a sandwich, though he hadn't touched either, and slung his duffel over his shoulder. As he walked toward the door, his gait was steady, purposeful, but there was no hint of anger or shame. To the casual observer, it might have looked like another case of a vagrant being shown the door. To those paying closer attention, there was something odd in how he moved, the way he kept his head just slightly turned toward the street outside, as though anticipating something. Once outside, he didn't leave immediately. He stopped at the edge of the parking lot, setting the duffel down beside him, and glanced toward the distant tree line beyond the road. It was subtle, but there was tension in the way he stood now, as though a switch had flipped from passive to alert. Inside, Kyle returned to the counter, muttering about standards and appearances, earning a few nods from customers who didn't question his judgment. The waitress, though, frowned slightly. She had caught the briefest glimpse of something on the man's wrist when he adjusted his bag strap, a worn leather band with an emblem that looked military. She told herself it was probably nothing, but the image lingered in her mind. 10 minutes passed. Conversations resumed, plates clattered in the kitchen, the smell of fried chicken drifted through the air. And then it started. A low, distant hum that didn't belong to any car or boat. It grew louder, the pitch shifting into a deep, rhythmic thump. A few people looked up, puzzled. The sound intensified, rattling the silverware on the tables, until finally someone pressed their face to the window and shouted, "What the?" Every head turned as the unmistakable silhouette of a Black Hawk helicopter came into view, gliding over the hill and descending toward the diner's parking lot. Dust and gravel whipped into the air as it hovered, the force of the rotor wash making people shield their eyes. In the center of the chaos stood the stranger, now upright and squared, his eyes locked on the aircraft, as if greeting an old friend. No one could yet comprehend what they were seeing or why the helicopter was here, but the man's posture told a story no one in that diner had expected. In the next few moments, their understanding of him and of the assumptions they'd made would be shattered completely. This was no ordinary drifter. This was the beginning of a story the people of Briar Ridge would be telling for years to come. The roar of the Black Hawk's engines seemed to suspend the entire town in a moment of disbelief. The air outside the diner became a swirling storm of dust and grit, pelting against the windows with a relentless force. Inside, customers stood frozen in their booths, eyes wide as the massive helicopter settled into the narrow parking lot with the precision of a practiced maneuver. Its matte black exterior gleamed in the midday sun, and the insignia on its side, a golden falcon clutching lightning bolts, was barely visible through the haze. The sheer power of the machine was enough to make hearts race, but it was the strange, silent man standing at the center of it all that anchored everyone's attention. Even Kyle, who moments earlier had ushered him out with the dismissive efficiency of someone taking out the trash, now found himself staring with an uneasy feeling clawing at his gut. The stranger didn't flinch under the punishing blast of the rotor wash. His stance was solid, his gaze fixed on the crew that was now visible through the open side door of the aircraft. Figures in dark uniforms, helmets gleaming, began to appear in the doorway. One of them was already gesturing toward the man, and though the noise drowned out all sound, the intent was unmistakable. They were here for him. The waitress, still holding an empty water glass in her hand, felt her mind racing to connect the dots. The emblem she'd glimpsed on his wrist, the way he had scanned the diner earlier, the absence of fear now as the helicopter hovered mere feet away, none of it belonged to someone adrift without purpose. She glanced toward Kyle, whose face had shifted from smug certainty to something far less confident. The heat of the August sun, combined with the dry wind from the rotors, made the scene outside shimmer like a mirage. But this was no illusion. The helicopter touched down fully, the skids biting into the gravel, and the air exploded with movement. Two soldiers jumped down, their boots hitting the ground with practiced force. One moved to secure the perimeter, scanning the surroundings with sharp, rapid motions, while the other strode directly toward the stranger. The precision of their movements was surgical, their posture carrying the same quiet authority that the man in the worn jacket had exuded moments earlier inside the diner. The stranger didn't move until the soldier reached him. Then, with a calm efficiency that spoke of years of discipline, he bent to pick up his duffel and slung it over his shoulder again. The two men exchanged a brief look, no words audible, yet something passed between them, recognition, respect, and urgency, all in one. Without hesitation, the stranger followed the soldier toward the helicopter, his long strides cutting through the whipping dust. From inside the diner, the customers pressed closer to the glass, each of them grasping for some explanation. Theories buzzed in whispered tones, but no one dared to say them too loudly for fear of sounding foolish. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Kyle didn't move from behind the counter, his mind replaying the image of the man leaving crumpled bills on the table before stepping out. The realization was beginning to creep in that he might have just made a very public mistake. As the stranger approached the helicopter, the crew inside shifted to make space. Another figure emerged from the cockpit, this one wearing no helmet, his close-cropped hair catching with sun. Even from a distance, the way the pilot clasped the stranger's shoulder carried a weight of familiarity. There was no mistaking it.
This was a reunion of comrades, not strangers. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of immediately boarding, the stranger turned back toward the diner. Through the cloud of dust, his gaze swept over the glass where the onlookers stood. His eyes paused for the briefest moment, locking on the waitress. It wasn't an accusatory look, nor was it triumphant. It was something more complicated. A silent acknowledgement, a nod that seemed to say that whatever assumptions had been made, the truth was far different. The waitress felt her throat tighten, unsure why such a small gesture could carry so much weight. The moment was broken by the sharp motion of the soldier at his side, urging him toward the aircraft. He climbed aboard, disappearing into the dim interior, and seconds later the helicopter began to lift. The noise grew deafening again, dust swirling into choking clouds as the Black Hawk rose steadily above the lot. People shielded their eyes, watching as the machine banked hard to the east, skimming low over the rooftops before vanishing beyond the ridge. The parking lot was left in disarray. Overturned trash bins, a scattering of napkins and menus blown from tables near the door, and a crowd of stunned witnesses who weren't sure whether they had just imagined it all.
The stillness that followed was almost as jarring as the arrival itself. The hum of cicadas filled the silence, and a faint smell of burnt fuel lingered in the air. Slowly, conversations resumed, though they were hushed and uncertain. Every person had their own theory, pieced together from half-seen details and assumptions. Some swore the man had been part of some secret military unit. Others thought it was a rescue operation or the extraction of a fugitive. Kyle kept silent, though his mind churned with thoughts he couldn't shake. He had made a decision based solely on appearances, and in doing so, he had misread the situation in a way that now made his stomach knot. The waitress, meanwhile, felt a strange pull to know more. There had been something in the stranger's eyes, not just discipline or authority, but a quiet weariness, the kind carried only by those who had seen too much and survived. She had the sense that whatever had brought the Black Hawk to Briar Ridge was not over, and that the story unfolding around them was only just beginning. The hours after the helicopter's departure passed in a haze of speculation that clung to the diner like the scent of coffee grounds. Customers lingered longer than usual, nursing refills and replaying the scene in their minds, each trying to cement their version of events before the memory blurred. The waitress, whose name was Marissa, busied herself with clearing tables, but couldn't shake the image of the stranger's eyes meeting hers just before he boarded. It had felt deliberate, almost like he was leaving a message without words. Outside, the summer heat still shimmered off the asphalt, and the parking lot bore the marks of the helicopter's arrival, a swath of disturbed gravel, scattered debris, and the faint twin impressions of the landing skids. People who had missed the event altogether were now showing up, drawn by the excited retellings from witnesses. They examined the ground like amateur detectives, pointing to the dust patterns as though they could decode the truth from them. Inside, Kyle kept his head down, pretending to focus on inventory sheets, though his eyes frequently flicked toward the door. His earlier confidence, that sense of authority he wore like a badge, had evaporated, replaced by an unsettled restlessness. Every time he thought of the moment he told the stranger to leave, a wave of discomfort rippled through him. He told himself it was justified. He had a business to run, a reputation to maintain. But the truth gnawed at him. He had made the man's appearance the deciding factor, without so much as asking his name. By late afternoon, the diner had quieted. The lunch rush was over, and only a few patrons remained, their conversations reduced to murmurs. Marissa was wiping down the counter when the door opened again, and a man she didn't recognize stepped inside. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the same economical movements she had noticed in the stranger earlier. His clothes were plain but clean, a faded gray t-shirt, dark cargo pants, boots scuffed from use but well-maintained. He scanned the diner with a quick, sweeping glance before approaching the counter. His eyes landed on Kyle, then on Marissa, before settling back on Kyle.
There was no hostility in his face, but there was an unmistakable sharpness, as though he could see through any pretense. Without ordering, he asked where the man with the duffel bag had gone earlier. The question cut through the low hum of conversation, drawing curious glances from the remaining customers. Kyle hesitated, caught between his instinct to guard his pride and the sudden awareness that this was not a man to bluff. Marissa answered instead, telling him that the man had left with the helicopter crew. The newcomer's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion but in thought. He thanked her, then reached into his back pocket and pulled out a card, sliding it across the counter toward Kyle. It bore no company logo, no phone number, just a name and a single embossed emblem, the same golden falcon she had glimpsed on the helicopter. The man told Kyle that if the stranger returned, he was to call the number on the back immediately. The words were delivered in a steady tone, not a request, but an instruction, and then he left as quietly as he had arrived. Marissa picked up the card after he was gone, turning it over in her hands. The number was a long string, with no area code she recognized. The paper itself felt heavier than normal, the kind that didn't crease easily. Kyle muttered something about not wanting to be caught up in whatever this was, but there was a hint of nervousness in his voice. The card seemed to hum with unanswered questions, and Marissa slipped it into her apron pocket, unsure why she felt compelled to keep it close. By late afternoon, the story of the helicopter had spread beyond Briar Ridge. Social media posts from customers had circulated, accompanied by grainy cell phone videos of the landing. One clip, shaky and partially obscured by a dusty window, had already racked up thousands of views, and people were debating in the comments whether it had been a training exercise or a real-world operation. Theories multiplied, ranging from a covert rescue mission to the extraction of a high-value target. Amid the noise, one detail kept resurfacing: the man in the worn jacket who had been waiting in the parking lot before the Black Hawk arrived. As night fell, Marissa walked home along the quiet streets, her thoughts circling back to him. She replayed every detail she could remember: the scuffed boots, the careful way he observed his surroundings, the faint emblem on his wrist. She thought of the way he had left the diner without protest, as though the confrontation with Kyle had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. People who carried grudges didn't stand like that. They didn't meet a helicopter head-on with calm acceptance. Whatever his story was, it was buried deep. And the only thing certain was that it hadn't ended when the Black Hawk disappeared over the ridge. In the darkness above the lake, a distant rumble echoed, not a helicopter this time, but the low growl of an approaching storm. Somewhere out there, the stranger was moving toward the next chapter of whatever mission he had been pulled into, and Marissa had the unshakable feeling that Briar Ridge hadn't seen the last of him. The storm rolled in overnight, heavy clouds pressing low over Briar Ridge by dawn, muting the normally bright summer colors into shades of gray. Rain slicked the streets, tapping against the diner's windows in a steady rhythm that seemed to hush the usual morning chatter. Marissa arrived early for her shift, the card from the mysterious man still tucked into the inner pocket of her bag. She had thought about it more than she cared to admit, her curiosity gnawing at her common sense. The golden falcon emblem wasn't something you saw every day, and she had the creeping sense that carrying it around was like holding onto a lit match in a dry forest. Kyle was already at the counter, sipping his coffee and staring at the door as if expecting someone. The brashness he'd shown the day before was gone, replaced by an unsettled energy. He avoided meeting her eyes, and when he spoke, it was with an uncharacteristic hesitance. He asked if she thought the man from yesterday might come back, his voice low enough to be drowned out by the hiss of the espresso machine. She didn't answer directly, only mentioning that people like him didn't just disappear. They were the kind you ended up seeing again, whether you wanted to or not. The breakfast crowd trickled in, but the buzz that had filled the diner the previous afternoon was absent. Instead, there was a strange undercurrent in the air, as if everyone had collectively agreed not to talk too loudly about what had happened, afraid the truth might overhear them. Some pretended to have no interest at all, but their eyes flicked toward the windows every time a car slowed outside. Around mid-morning, Marissa noticed two black SUVs glide past the diner without stopping. They moved with a strange synchronicity, each keeping perfect distance from the other, and both had heavily tinted windows. She watched them disappear around the bend, her pulse ticking up despite her effort to stay calm. Something about their presence felt purposeful, too deliberate to be coincidence. The rain eased slightly, and a thin mist began to rise from the asphalt. The quiet inside the diner deepened when the door swung open to admit a man in a dark rain jacket, his hood pulled low. He carried no umbrella, and his boots left small puddles on the floor as he stepped in. When he pushed back the hood, Marissa recognized the sharp eyes immediately. Not the stranger from yesterday, but the man who had come later, the one who had left the card. He approached the counter without preamble, scanning the room once before focusing on her. He asked if the man with the duffel had returned or made contact. Kyle's hands fidgeted with the edge of a napkin dispenser, and he shook his head quickly. Marissa said nothing, only shook her head as well, though the card in her bag seemed to grow heavier by the second. The man's gaze lingered on her for a fraction of a second longer than anyone else, and she had the uncomfortable sensation that he could tell she had kept the card. Without another word, he stepped back outside, disappearing into the rain. Through the window, she saw him climb into one of the black SUVs now parked across the street. The vehicle idled for a moment before both SUVs pulled away in unison, heading in the same direction they'd gone earlier. Whispers broke out among the customers, their voices low and urgent. Theories multiplied once again. Government agents, undercover cops, mercenaries. Someone claimed to have seen the same SUVs parked by the old airfield on the edge of town, though no one had been to that property in years. Marissa pretended to ignore the chatter, but her mind was already connecting threads she couldn't quite weave into a full picture. The Black Hawk, the emblem, the card, the SUVs, each piece hinted at something much larger, something operating far beyond the quiet confines of Briar Ridge. By noon, the rain had stopped completely, leaving the air heavy and still. Marissa took her break outside, leaning against the side of the diner and watching the clouds drift apart. She thought about the stranger again, picturing him walking into some hidden command center or stepping onto another helicopter far from here. The memory of his calm, almost resigned expression when Kyle had told him to leave unsettled her in a way she couldn't explain. He knew something was coming, and he was ready for it. That kind of readiness wasn't born overnight. A sudden sound snapped her attention back to the parking lot, the rumble of a motorcycle engine, deep and steady. A dark bike rolled into view, its rider wearing a matte black helmet and a worn leather jacket that looked like it had been through a dozen storms. The rider parked near the side of the building and dismounted without removing the helmet. Something about the deliberate way they moved made Marissa's heart jump.
The figure stepped inside, and as the helmet came off, her breath caught. It was the stranger. His hair was damp, his jaw shadowed with stubble, but his eyes were exactly as she remembered. Sharp, assessing, taking in everything without hurry. He didn't look toward Kyle, didn't acknowledge the sudden hush that fell over the diner. Instead, he walked straight to an empty booth in the corner, the same one he had occupied before, and set his duffel down beside him. Without speaking, he opened the menu, as though nothing at all had happened in the last 24 hours. The silence stretched, heavy with unasked questions, until Marissa found herself moving toward him almost without thinking, the card in her pocket suddenly burning like a live coal. Marissa approached the booth with deliberate slowness, every step feeling heavier than the last. The diner was so quiet she could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator behind the counter, the occasional clink of silverware from a customer who was pretending not to stare. The stranger didn't look up until she was nearly at his table. When his eyes met hers, she felt the same strange pull as the day before, a quiet intensity that seemed to strip away the noise of the world. He closed the menu without having read a single page and asked for just coffee, his voice low and even. Marissa nodded, but her mind was a storm of questions. She turned toward the counter, glancing briefly at Kyle, who stood stiffly near the register, his hands clasped in front of him like he wasn't sure whether to intervene or stay out of it. When she returned with the coffee, she slid it onto the table and hesitated, her hand brushing the edge of the pocket where the card rested. The stranger's gaze flicked downward, and for a heartbeat, she thought he knew she had it. Instead, he simply thanked her and took a slow sip, his eyes scanning the diner again as though assessing for changes since his last visit. Outside, the sky was clearing, sunlight beginning to break through the retreating clouds, casting long beams across the wet pavement. Every time someone passed by the front window, the stranger's eyes tracked their movement, not out of idle curiosity, but with the calculated precision of someone trained to notice patterns, threats, and escape routes. The customers sensed it too, a subtle shift in the air around him that made it impossible to mistake him for anything other than what he truly was, but no one dared voice it. After a few minutes, Marissa gathered her courage and asked if he wanted anything else. He shook his head, setting the cup down gently, and asked her in return if anyone had come looking for him. The question was simple, but it carried weight. She thought of the man in the rain jacket, the SUVs, the lingering stares from their tinted windows, and she nodded. She told him someone had left a card for him, and without waiting for his reply, she reached into her pocket and placed it on the table. His eyes locked on it immediately. For the first time, a flicker of something passed across his face. Recognition followed quickly by calculation. He picked up the card, turned it over once, then slid it into his own jacket without word. Marissa opened her mouth to ask what it meant, but he lifted a hand slightly, a gesture not of dismissal but of patience, as if to say the time wasn't right. Before she could press him, the rumble of engines drew their attention toward the window. The same pair of black SUVs had returned, gliding into the lot with the same precise formation as before. The stranger's posture shifted imperceptibly, the easy stillness replaced by a readiness that was almost electric. He didn't stand immediately. Instead, he finished the last of his coffee and set the cup down neatly, his eyes never leaving the vehicles. The SUVs stopped near the far edge of the lot, their engines idling. The rear door of the lead vehicle opened, and the man in the rain jacket stepped out once again. This time, he didn't bother with the hood. He walked toward the diner with measured strides, his gaze fixed on the stranger. The door swung open, and all conversation inside ceased entirely. The man stopped a few feet from the booth, his eyes scanning the stranger's face. They didn't shake hands, didn't greet each other in any conventional way, yet the air between them was thick with unspoken history. Finally, the man in the rain jacket spoke, his voice low but carrying in the silence, telling the stranger it was time to go. The stranger didn't argue. He rose smoothly, slinging his duffel over his shoulder. Before following the man outside, he glanced at Marissa once more. There was something in his eyes again. Not gratitude exactly, but acknowledgement, the kind of look that made her feel as though she had passed some unspoken test. Kyle, standing rigid behind the counter, shifted uncomfortably as they passed. Outside, the stranger paused just long enough to look up and down the street, then followed the man toward the SUVs. The rear door opened, and he climbed in without hesitation. Both vehicles pulled away together, heading once more toward the road out of town. The moment they were gone, the tension in the diner snapped like a stretched wire. Customers began talking again, voices rising with speculation. Some were convinced they had witnessed the lead-up to another helicopter arrival, while others thought the man was being taken somewhere against his will.
Marissa said nothing, returning to her work with movements that felt mechanical. She couldn't stop replaying the look he had given her and the way he had taken the card without explanation. There was no doubt in her mind now that he was involved in something far bigger than she could imagine, and the sight of the SUVs vanishing into the distance left her with the uneasy feeling that whatever this was, it was only getting closer to revealing itself. Far out beyond the ridge, the road curved toward the old airfield, a place most locals had long since forgotten. That night, when the wind shifted, a deep, rhythmic thump would carry faintly over the town, barely loud enough for anyone to notice, but for those who did, it would sound unmistakably like the distant blades of a helicopter cutting through the dark. That night, the sound came again, clearer this time. It rolled in over Briar Ridge just past midnight, a low, pulsing rhythm that seemed to vibrate through the still air. Most people slept through it, but for those awake, there was no mistaking the mechanical cadence of rotor blades. Marissa heard it from her apartment above the hardware store, the faint thump, 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 carrying over the rooftops. She rose from bed and stepped to the window, peering out into the darkness. The street below was empty, washed in the pale glow of the lone street lamp, but somewhere beyond the hills, something was moving through the night sky. She thought of the stranger, of the SUVs heading toward the abandoned airfield, and the unease in her chest tightened. Sleep was impossible after that. She sat at her kitchen table with a mug of tea growing cold, staring at the card she had given back to him earlier that day. Its absence felt strange, as if by holding it she had been tethered to something hidden, and now that tether had been cut. By morning, the town was buzzing again. A few early risers claimed to have seen faint lights over the ridge during the night, weaving low like they were avoiding detection. Others dismissed it as storms breaking apart in the upper atmosphere, but their voices lacked conviction. At the diner, the usual morning crowd seemed oddly subdued, their conversations drifting back to the events of the last 2 days, despite their attempts to focus on fishing trips and the upcoming fair. Kyle was in the kitchen more than usual, leaving Marissa to handle the counter. His avoidance was obvious. He didn't want to be the face associated with the man he had thrown out. Around mid-morning, the quiet was broken by a new arrival. A woman walked in, tall and lean, wearing a dark green jacket and boots dusted from travel. Her hair was tied back, and her eyes swept the room in the same calculating way the strangers had. She approached the counter with the easy authority of someone used to being in control. Without introducing herself, she asked Marissa if she had seen a man matching the stranger's description. Her voice was firm, but not aggressive, her tone carrying an undercurrent of urgency. Marissa hesitated, unsure how much to say, but the woman leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. She said she wasn't with the men in the SUVs. In fact, she was looking for him before they found him. That made Marissa's pulse quicken. She asked why, but the woman only replied that the man had once saved her life and that if the wrong people reached him first, it would be too late. Marissa thought about the quiet way he had handled himself, the unshakable composure, the look he had given her before leaving. She couldn't tell whether this woman was trustworthy, but something about her eyes, clear, unwavering, carrying the weight of her words, made her believe she wasn't lying. Still, she tread carefully, mentioning only that he had been in the diner twice and that the last time he had left with the men from the SUVs. The woman's jaw tightened. She asked if they had said where they were going, but Marissa shook her head. The woman nodded once, as though she had expected that answer, and slipped a folded piece of paper across the counter. It had a phone number written in neat block letters and a brief note. "If you see him again, call immediately." Without waiting for questions, she left, disappearing down the street. The rest of the day passed in a haze of distraction. Marissa kept replaying the conversation, the woman's urgency ringing in her ears. She thought of the old airfield again, the place where the SUVs had been rumored to go. It had been abandoned for years, its runways cracked and overgrown, hangars rusting into the ground. No one had reason to go there, no one except perhaps people who wanted privacy. Late in the afternoon, 2 locals came into the diner with fresh gossip. They claimed to have driven past the road leading to the airfield and seen a guard posted there, dressed in black and carrying a rifle. That sent another wave of speculation through the room, but Marissa noticed that Kyle kept his head down, pretending not to hear. By evening, she couldn't shake the feeling that events were tightening around the stranger. 2 different groups were looking for him, one of which clearly had the resources to move fast and enforce. The question was, why? She thought about calling the number the woman had left just to see if she could learn more, but stopped herself. It was dangerous to get involved in something she didn't understand.
Yet, as night fell, the distant thump of rotor blades returned, louder this time, followed by a brief flare of light over the ridge, a flash so quick it could have been lightning, but the sky was clear. She stood at her window again, heart pounding, and told herself she would stay out of it. But deep down, she knew that if the stranger walked back into the diner tomorrow, she would find herself pulled in further, no matter how hard she tried to resist. Somewhere out there, in the shadows beyond Briar Ridge, pieces were moving into place, and the quiet life of the town was about to shatter in ways none of them could yet imagine.
The next morning, the air over Briar Ridge felt heavier, as though the entire town was bracing for something it could not yet name. Marissa woke early, her mind still tangled in the events of the past 2 days, and as she prepared for work, she kept glancing out her window toward the distant ridge. The streets were unusually quiet for that hour. Fewer trucks rumbled past, and the usual chatter of neighbors starting their day was missing. When she reached the diner, she found Kyle already there, pacing by the counter, his apron hanging loose around his neck. He didn't greet her, didn't crack a joke, or complain about deliveries, just muttered something about the coffee machine acting up and retreated into the kitchen. His behavior was strange, but Marissa didn't press him. She had learned that Kyle only opened up when he wanted to, and something told her today wasn't that day. As the first customers trickled in, she noticed more than one person glancing toward the windows whenever a vehicle passed. The sound of engines seemed to make people stiffen, and more than once she caught snippets of conversation about those guys who had been seen at the airfield. Word had spread quickly about the armed guard, and speculation had taken root. Some said it was a film crew working on a secret project. Others whispered about government experiments, and a few insisted it was just a militia playing soldier. But beneath the theories, there was an unspoken fear that whatever it wasn't harmless. Around mid-morning, a familiar figure appeared in the doorway, and Marissa felt her pulse jump. It wasn't the stranger. It was the woman from the day before, her green jacket dusted with road grime, her eyes even sharper than before. She walked straight to the counter, ignoring the curious stares from other patrons, and leaned in close to speak to Marissa in a low voice. She said she had confirmation that the men in the SUVs were still holding the stranger at the airfield. She also said they weren't law enforcement, not officially at least, and that whatever they were doing was off the books. She asked if Marissa had seen anything unusual since their last conversation. And when Marissa hesitated, she added that time was running out. That was when Marissa mentioned the sounds she had heard at night, the rotor blades, the flashes of light. The woman's expression hardened, and she asked if Marissa could take her to a place where she could get a clear view of the reg. Against her better judgment, Marissa agreed, finishing her shift early by claiming she wasn't feeling well. They drove out in Marissa's truck, taking a narrow dirt road that climbed the western slope. The woman barely spoke, her gaze fixed on the horizon, and when they finally reached a turnout with an unobstructed view of the ridge and the valley beyond, she pulled a small pair of binoculars from her jacket. Through them, she scanned the landscape for a long moment before letting out a slow breath. She told Marissa that there were faint signs of activity near the old hangars, a glint of metal, the shimmer of heat from engines, and the movement of figures too far away to identify. Then she said something that made Marissa's stomach twist. The stranger wasn't just any veteran. He had once been part of a specialized unit that was trained to extract high-value targets from hostile situations. If the men holding him were who she thought they were, they might be trying to force him to do something for them. She didn't explain what that something was, but the weight in her voice made it sound dangerous. They stayed at the lookout for another half hour before heading back. On the drive down, they passed 2 black trucks heading toward the ridge, their windows tinted, their tires kicking up dust. Neither woman spoke until they reached town. Before leaving, the woman handed Marissa a small radio, telling her it would work even if cell service was cut. She said she might be out of contact for a day or two, but if Marissa saw or heard anything unusual, she was to use the radio immediately. As she slipped it into her bag, she felt the reality of the situation settling over her. This wasn't just about a man being mistreated in a diner anymore. Something larger was unfolding, and she was now tied to it in a way she couldn't undo. That night, the thump of rotor blades returned, closer and more deliberate, as if whatever was moving out there was drawing near. Marissa stood by her window, the radio in her hand, wondering if she was about to become part of something she had no business being involved in. In the distance, just over the ridge, a faint red light blinked in the darkness, and the heavy air seemed to press down even harder.
The following day dawned with an uneasy calm, the kind that felt like the world was holding its breath. Marissa woke before her alarm. The faint red light from the ridge still burned into her mind from the night before. She brewed a pot of coffee, But even that familiar ritual did nothing to settle her nerves. The radio the woman had given her sat on the kitchen counter, a silent presence she kept glancing at, as though expecting it to spring to life on its own. Outside, the streets of Briar Ridge seemed unusually sparse for a weekday morning. The regular morning bustle of delivery trucks, dog walkers, and parents hustling children to school was muted, replaced by a strange watchfulness. People stood in small clusters outside shops, speaking in low tones, their eyes darting toward the road that led out to the old airfield. At the diner, the regular customers were quieter than usual, and those who did speak seemed to stick to topics that skirted the tension hanging over the town. Kyle seemed especially on edge, pacing between tables more than serving them, his gaze flicking constantly to the parking lot, as though expecting someone or something to arrive. Marissa noticed he hadn't even made his usual sarcastic remarks about tourists or the weather. It was as if everyone was waiting for a shoe to drop, but no one wanted to be the one to say it out loud. By mid-morning, the atmosphere shifted again, when a low, heavy rumble passed overhead. Marissa froze, a coffee pot in hand, as the sound grew louder and deeper. It wasn't the choppy thrum of a civilian helicopter. It was heavier, more deliberate, each rotation of the blades pounding in her chest. She stepped outside, shielding her eyes against the late morning glare, and caught a glimpse of something dark slicing across the sky above the ridge. A helicopter, painted in matte black, moving low and slow, as if scanning the ground. It passed over the ridge and disappeared beyond the tree line, but the sound lingered in her ears long after it was gone. When she turned back toward the diner, she noticed that several patrons had stepped outside to watch as well, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright fear. One older man muttered something about military types and shook his head before retreating inside. Around lunchtime, a convoy of 3 unmarked SUVs rolled into town, pulling into the parking lot of the gas station across the street. The drivers didn't get out immediately, but when they did, it was clear they weren't locals. Tall, broad men, dressed in plain clothes that somehow still looked uniform, their movements crisp, their eyes scanning constantly. They spoke briefly with the gas station attendant, then seemed to fan out in pairs, walking through town like they were on patrol. Marissa's pulse quickened as one of them passed the diner window, glancing inside with an expression that was unreadable but far from casual. The radio in her bag felt heavier now, its presence no longer a quiet reassurance, but a reminder that she was holding a thread connected to something far bigger than herself. That afternoon, the woman in the green jacket returned, slipping into the diner without a sound. She didn't bother ordering food this time, just slid into a booth near the back and motioned for Marissa to join her. When Marissa did, she leaned in and said in a low voice that the helicopter wasn't just a random flyover. It was a Black Hawk, and it had landed somewhere near the airfield earlier that morning. She had contacts trying to confirm if it was friendly or hostile, but either way, it meant things were escalating. Marissa asked if the stranger was still alive, and the woman hesitated before nodding. She said he was tough, tougher than most people realized, but he wouldn't last forever under pressure. The woman then told Marissa that she needed to be ready because if her plan worked, they might only have minutes to act when the moment came. That night, the wind carried a faint metallic scent into town, like hot engine oil and ozone, the kind of smell that came from machinery working hard under strain. The air was thick and warm, almost electric, and Marissa found herself standing at her window again, the radio clutched in her hand. At first, there was only the distant hum of crickets and the occasional passing car. Then, just after midnight, the radio crackled to life with a short, sharp burst of static, followed by the woman's voice, clipped and urgent. She didn't waste time on greetings. She simply said that the stranger had made contact, that he was still at the airfield, and that a large movement was about to happen. Marissa was to watch for the helicopter and be ready for instructions. The transmission ended before Marissa could even respond. She stood there in the dark, her heart pounding, every instinct telling her that she was standing on the edge of something irreversible. Somewhere in the distance, beyond the ridge, the deep, rhythmic chop of rotor blades began again, closer this time, and moving fast.
The sound grew steadily louder, each beat of the rotor blades pressing against the still night air until it seemed to vibrate through the floorboards of Marissa's apartment. She could feel it in her chest, a deep and insistent thrum that carried with it a sense of urgency, of something on the verge of happening. She pulled on her jacket without thinking, her hands moving on instinct, and slipped the radio into her pocket before stepping outside.
The streets were nearly empty, the few people who were out standing still as statues, their eyes turned toward the dark horizon where the sound was coming from. A child clutched her mother's hand, the woman holding her close as if to shield her from a storm. Over the rooftops, the first shadow of the Black Hawk emerged, its silhouette enormous against the moonlit clouds. It moved low and fast, its navigation lights blinking in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Marissa's breath caught as it passed overhead, the downwash from its rotors sending leaves and debris skittering across the pavement. The sheer power of it was impossible to ignore. It wasn't here for a joyride or a routine drill. This was a machine that came only when there was real work to be done, the kind that left a mark on everything it touched. The helicopter began to slow as it approached the old airfield, tilting slightly as it descended, and though it was still some distance away, Marissa could see that it was not alone. Two smaller helicopters followed behind it, their engines screaming in higher-pitched harmony. She had never seen anything like this in Briar Ridge. It felt like watching a scene from a war zone unfolding in the middle of their sleepy town. The radio in her pocket hissed again, and the woman's voice came through more tense than before. She told Marissa to get to the diner's parking lot immediately, to wait by the far corner where the streetlight had gone out weeks ago. The voice made it clear. This wasn't a request, it was the moment they had been preparing for. Marissa didn't hesitate. She jogged through the quiet streets, her footsteps echoing against the walls of shuttered shops. Every instinct in her body told her she was moving toward the center of something dangerous, but she couldn't turn back. When she reached the diner, the parking lot was empty, except for the shadows cast by the dim glow of the remaining lights. She stood in the designated corner, her eyes scanning the sky, her ears tracking the deepening growl of engines overhead. In the distance, the Black Hawk had landed at the airfield, its powerful searchlights sweeping over the tarmac like the eyes of some great predator. The smaller helicopters hovered nearby, creating a constant whirl of dust and noise. Suddenly, a set of headlights cut across the lot, and one of the unmarked SUVs from the day before pulled up. The rear door opened before the vehicle had even fully stopped, and the woman in the green jacket stepped out, her expression sharp and purposeful. She motioned for Marissa to get in, and without a word, Marissa obeyed. Inside, the air smelled faintly of fuel and metal, and the low rumble of the engine was almost drowned out by the chaos in the distance. The SUV sped toward the outskirts of town, taking a side road that Marissa had rarely traveled. The woman explained quickly that the man they'd been watching for was being extracted tonight, that the presence of the helicopters meant the clock was ticking faster than they had hoped. She told Marissa that when they arrived, she was to stay close, follow her lead, and not speak unless spoken to. There were people involved who wouldn't take kindly to outsiders, but for reasons the woman didn't explain, Marissa was needed there. The road narrowed as they approached the ridge, the sound of the helicopters now so loud it felt like it was inside her head. The SUV slowed, turning onto a gravel path that wound through a stand of pines before opening up to a wide clearing on the far side of the airfield's perimeter. Through the trees, Marissa could see the hulking shape of the Black Hawk, its rotors still spinning lazily as figures in tactical gear moved quickly around it. Bright, portable floodlights lit up the scene, casting sharp shadows and highlighting the glint of metal weapons and equipment. A group of men stood near the edge of the clearing, their faces partially obscured by helmets and night vision goggles, but their posture radiated discipline and readiness. As the SUV rolled to a stop, the woman stepped out first, signaling to one of the men who broke away from the group to meet them. He spoke briefly with her, his voice low but urgent, then turned to glance at Marissa, his eyes narrowing slightly as if assessing whether she belonged there. Whatever he saw seemed to satisfy him, because he gave a curt nod and stepped aside. Marissa followed the woman into the heart of the operation, her senses overwhelmed by the noise, the lights, and the sheer precision of the people around her. In the center of the activity, two soldiers were helping a man out of the back of a transport truck. Even from a distance, Marissa could see that he was injured,
His left arm was bound in a makeshift sling, and there was a weariness in his movements that spoke of days without rest. Yet there was also a calm in his face, a steadiness in his eyes that told her this was no ordinary man. The woman in the green jacket moved toward him, speaking in a tone that carried both familiarity and authority. Marissa stood frozen at the edge of the scene, watching as the injured man straightened, glanced around at the assembled personnel, and finally let his gaze settle on the Blackhawk. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and in that moment Marissa knew without being told that whatever was happening here was the culmination of years of skill, loyalty, and sacrifice. The air vibrated with the hum of readiness, and she understood that the night was far from over.
Marissa barely had time to take in the scene before movement rippled through the group like a silent signal. The injured man, now supported on both sides by two soldiers in dark uniforms, was guided toward the open side door of the Blackhawk. Its interior glowed faintly under red tactical lights, the kind that preserve night vision, and every inch of space inside seemed filled with equipment and readiness. The air reeked of aviation fuel, sharp and heavy, mingling with the scent of dust kicked up by the constant churn of the rotors. The woman in the green jacket walked ahead, exchanging quick, clipped words with a man who looked like he could command a small army with a single glance. He wasn't wearing a name tag, but the air around him practically hummed with authority. Marissa recognized the subtle shift in posture from the soldiers around him. This was someone who wasn't just part of the operation, but the one steering its entire course. She felt like she was standing in the center of a scene no civilian was ever meant to witness, the kind of moment that never made it to the news, but decided the fates of people and places far beyond her understanding. The injured man paused at the foot of the helicopter step, looking back over the clearing as if committing every detail to memory. His eyes swept past the floodlights, the tactical teams, and even the woman in the green jacket, before they landed on Marissa. It was only for a heartbeat, but it felt like he was looking straight through her, weighing something about her presence that she didn't even understand herself. Then, without a word, he turned and climbed inside, his movements slow but deliberate. Two soldiers followed, strapping him into one of the seats and securing his gear, while another passed a headset into his hands. The command figure turned to the woman in the green jacket and gave a sharp nod. She responded by signaling to one of the SUV drivers parked near the tree line, and instantly the vehicle's engine roared to life. Marissa realized they weren't staying here. Whatever this man's extraction meant, it was only the beginning of whatever was supposed to happen next. She was ushered quickly toward the SUV, her questions burning inside her, but held back by the unspoken rule that no one here had time for explanations. As she slid inside, the driver threw the vehicle into gear, skidding slightly on the gravel before speeding down a narrow dirt road that curved away from the airfield. In the side mirror, Marissa caught one last glimpse of the Blackhawk's rotor spinning faster, the helicopter lifting slowly into the air with a grace that belied its bulk. It rose above the tree line, tilting into the wind, and then the sound of its blades began to fade, replaced by the steady hum of the SUV's tires on the uneven ground. The woman in the green jacket sat in the front passenger seat, speaking quietly into a secure radio. Her voice was calm, but every now and then a sharp edge crept into her tone, like someone making split-second adjustments to a plan under pressure. Marissa strained to catch fragments of the conversation. Phrases like rendezvous point, window is closing, and confirm overwatch in position. She didn't know what they meant in exact terms, but they painted a picture in her mind of something coordinated, something urgent, something that had no margin for error. They drove for nearly 20 minutes, the forest on either side thick and dark, until the trees suddenly opened up into another clearing. This one was smaller, quieter, but no less charged with tension. A small group of people stood waiting beside two more SUVs and a covered utility truck. The moment their vehicle rolled to a stop, the woman in the green jacket was out the door, striding toward the others with an energy that made everyone else straighten instinctively. Marissa followed more slowly, her eyes adjusting to the dim light cast by the single flood lamp set up near the truck.
The group was made up of men and women in various states of readiness, some in full tactical gear, others in plain clothes, but with the unmistakable bearing of people trained to move and act as a unit. A tall man with a weathered face and a deep scar along his jaw stepped forward to meet the woman. They spoke in low voices for a moment. Then he glanced toward Marissa, his expression unreadable. He didn't ask who she was or why she was there, but she could feel his scrutiny all the same. One of the other SUVs pulled forward, its headlights sweeping over the group, and from its back seat stepped a figure Marissa hadn't seen before. This man was older, his hair silver at the temples, but his posture was upright and his presence commanding. He wore no visible insignia, but even in the dim light, Marissa could sense the weight of his authority. The woman in the green jacket addressed him with a formality she hadn't used with anyone else, and the two began a rapid exchange of information. Marissa's attention kept drifting back to the covered truck. She couldn't see what was inside, but every instinct told her it was important, maybe even the reason for all of this movement tonight. As the conversation wrapped up, the older man gave a final order, his voice firm but low, and the group began moving with renewed purpose. Two people climbed into the utility truck, starting the engine, while others dispersed to their vehicles. The woman in the green jacket returned to Marissa's side, her gaze steady and unreadable. She told Marissa they were moving again, this time to a location even fewer people knew about, and that from this point forward she was to treat everything she saw and heard as classified.
Marissa didn't argue. Something about the weight in the woman's voice told her that this wasn't just about secrecy. It was about safety, hers and everyone else's. As they pulled out of the clearing, the convoy now moving as one, Marissa glanced back toward the utility truck one more time. The tarp covering its cargo shifted slightly with the movement, and for a split second she thought she saw the faint outline of something long, angular, and metallic. Whatever was under there, it wasn't meant for civilian eyes. The road ahead was dark and winding, but she could feel the momentum building. Whatever this night was leading to, it was moving fast, and there was no turning back now. The convoy moved deeper into the night, the beam of headlights cutting through the blackness while the engines hummed in tight unison. Marissa sat in the middle row of the SUV, her gaze darting between the passing blur of trees and the shadowy outlines of the other vehicles ahead and behind. There was an unshakable rhythm to the movement, a precision that spoke of experience. This was not a group simply driving from point A to point B. This was a carefully coordinated maneuver. The woman in the green jacket remained silent, her eyes fixed on the road ahead while one hand rested lightly on the radio clipped to her vest, ready to transmit at a moment's notice. Every so often, the static would break with a coded burst of chatter, followed by her quick, crisp acknowledgement. Marissa noticed that they never stayed on a straight route for long. The convoy took sharp turns, doubled back on certain stretches, and slipped through narrow side roads that seemed to vanish into the woods. It wasn't random. This was deliberate route changing, the kind of evasive pattern designed to shake a tail or mask their exact destination. The air inside the SUV was taut with unspoken understanding. Something out there might be watching, and no one wanted to be followed. The forest began to thin, replaced by open stretches of land where the wind moved more freely. In the distance, faint against the horizon, Marissa spotted the flicker of lights. Not bright enough to be a city, but perhaps a cluster of buildings. As they drew closer, she made out the faint outline of a long, low structure that looked abandoned, its roof sagging slightly and its walls bearing the weathered gray of age. Yet, as the convoy slowed to approach, she realized there was nothing abandoned about it. In the shadows near the far end, faint glimmers of movement revealed sentries, people in plain clothes but carrying the unmistakable posture of readiness. They were stationed at intervals, scanning the perimeter with disciplined, methodical precision. The SUVs rolled past without stopping, the sentries giving subtle nods of recognition before melting back into their positions. The lead vehicle slowed near a wide metal door at the side of the building. Without a word, a man in tactical gear emerged from the shadows, producing a handheld device that sent a quick pulse of light over the SUV's hood. Seconds later, the metal door groaned open, revealing a ramp that descended into the earth. The convoy moved inside one by one,
the heavy door sliding closed behind them until the outside world was sealed away. The ramp led to a cavernous underground space, lit by muted overhead strips. The air here was cooler, with the faint tang of oil and metal. The SUVs came to a stop in designated slots, and immediately the occupants disembarked. Marissa stepped out and found herself surrounded by organized chaos. Soldiers in dark uniforms unloading crates from the utility truck, technicians in coveralls running diagnostics on racks of equipment, and a handful of individuals gathered around a table covered in maps and satellite imagery. She felt small in the middle of it all, but her eyes couldn't help being drawn to the covered cargo from the truck. Now that they were inside, two men were unfastening the tarp, revealing the sleek, angular lines of a piece of machinery that looked like it belonged in a military exhibition rather than in the back of a transport. Its surface was matte black, absorbing the light around it, and its design was unmistakably functional, yet ominous. Marissa couldn't identify it, but she knew instinctively it was dangerous. The kind of dangerous that could change the balance of a fight before it even began. The older man with silver at his temples was there too, his presence commanding as he moved between groups, checking progress, issuing quiet orders. At one point, he stopped at the table of maps, leaning over to mark a location before straightening and glancing toward the machinery. The woman in the green jacket joined him, and the two spoke briefly, their exchange laced with a tone of decision-making rather than discussion. A large digital clock on the wall counted down in red digits, its steady progression an unyielding reminder that everything happening here was bound to a precise schedule. Marissa watched as a small team began attaching specialized components to the black device, their movements fast but careful. Each part seemed to lock into place with an audible click, like pieces of a weapon being assembled. Whatever this was, it was being prepared for immediate deployment. A sudden burst of static from the radios drew everyone's attention. One of the sentries from outside had reported in, movement detected, on the perimeter. The air shifted instantly, the hum of work replaced by the sharp focus of readiness. The silver-haired man gave a single hand signal, and in moments the machinery was covered again, its form once more hidden from sight. Tactical teams took up positions near entrances, while others moved toward the armory along the wall, retrieving weapons with practiced efficiency.
Marissa felt her heartbeat spike, not from fear alone, but from the weight of realization. Something was closing in on them. The woman in the green jacket moved to Marissa's side, her voice low but firm as she told her to stay close and not wander. They began moving toward a smaller side corridor that led deeper into the underground facility, the sound of boots echoing sharply against the concrete walls. The corridor twisted and descended further, the lights here dimmer until it opened into a secondary chamber lined with communication consoles. Screens displayed grainy feeds from external cameras, and Marissa could see vague shapes moving in the darkness outside. The operators were relaying updates in clipped, urgent tones, their hands flying over controls as they switched between angles. From what little she could gather, it wasn't a full-on assault yet, but someone was probing, testing the defenses, maybe looking for a way in. The older man arrived moments later, scanning the feeds before making a decision that sent another ripple of movement through the room. Teams were to be repositioned, and a contingency plan was to be activated. Marissa didn't know what the plan entailed, but she could feel the shift. The balance between control and chaos was teetering, and whatever happened next would either secure their position or unravel everything. Somewhere above them, faint but growing, came the low, rhythmic thump of rotor blades. Marissa's head snapped up instinctively, her mind flashing back to the Blackhawk that had first shattered the night. Only this time, she couldn't tell if the sound meant reinforcements or something far worse. The low thump of rotor blades grew steadily louder, reverberating through the underground chamber until it became a physical presence in the air, a deep vibration that made the concrete walls seem to hum. Everyone in the room paused for a fraction of a second, their eyes flicking upward as if they could see through the layers of earth and steel above them. The silver-haired man's expression remained unreadable, but his slight nod to the woman in the green jacket was enough to send her moving toward the exit at a purposeful stride. Marissa stayed close, matching her pace, her pulse quickening with every beat of the rotors above.
The sound wasn't just noise, it was a signal, a warning, and possibly a promise of imminent change. As they climbed back up the narrow corridor toward the surface level of the underground facility, the air grew warmer and tinged with the faint smell of fuel. The sound of organized movement intensified, boots striking concrete and sink, the metallic click of weapons being readied, the rasp of heavy crates being shifted into defensive positions. By the time they reached the loading bay where the convoy had first entered, the noise above was almost deafening. Dust drifted down from the high ceiling, shaken loose by the force of the helicopter's descent. The massive steel door that separated the bay from the outside world was still sealed, but a large monitor mounted on the wall displayed the live feed from an external camera. On the screen, Marissa saw it. A Black Hawk helicopter settling into the parking lot above, its rotors kicking up a whirlwind of debris and scattering loose gravel across the asphalt. The downwash flattened the tall grass around the lot, and the sheer force of it made the sentries on perimeter duty hunch low and brace themselves. The helicopter's matte black fuselage reflected almost no light, blending into the surrounding darkness except where the red and green navigation lights blinked in slow, deliberate intervals. As it touched down, the side door slid open before the rotors had even fully slowed. Figures began to emerge, not in a chaotic rush, but in precise, controlled motion. Each was clad in dark tactical gear that bore no insignia, their helmets equipped with mounted optics that glowed faintly in the night. Marissa's breath caught in her throat. Even without knowing their exact unit, she recognized the unmistakable discipline of elite military operators. They were not here for a casual visit. The steel door to the bay began to grind open, the hydraulics groaning under the strain, and the noise from the helicopter outside surged inward in a violent rush of wind and sound. Dust and grit swirled in the air, stinging Marissa's eyes as she squinted toward the widening gap. Through it, she caught glimpses of the operators fanning out from the helicopter, scanning the area with rifles at the ready. The lead operator, a tall figure with a squared jaw visible beneath his helmet, strode forward toward the door without hesitation, his gait purposeful and steady, despite the chaos of the rotors. Behind him, two more carried sealed, heavy-duty cases between them, the kind used to transport sensitive equipment or dangerous cargo. As the first of them stepped inside, the silver-haired man moved forward to greet them. No words could be heard over the helicopter's roar, but their brief exchange, a sharp nod from both, was enough to suggest they were not strangers. The operators moved quickly, the two with the cases heading straight toward the covered machinery in the center of the bay, while the others formed a protective perimeter around them. The woman in the green jacket stepped closer to the silver-haired man, speaking into his ear over the noise, and he gave a quick signal to one of the technicians, who immediately began unfastening the tarp covering the black device. The reveal was swift and efficient, and the operators wasted no time in unloading the heavy-duty cases to unload components that seemed to slot directly into the machinery like pieces of an intricate puzzle.
The technicians moved with them in perfect sync, attaching and locking each piece into place with satisfying precision. Watching it all unfold, Marissa couldn't shake the feeling that whatever this machine was, its full potential had only just been unlocked. Above the din, a voice crackled over the comms. Perimeter movement confirmed again. But this time, the tone carried more urgency. The camera feeds flicked to the outer edges of the lot, revealing dark shapes moving just beyond the reach of the lights. They were too far to identify clearly, but the movement was purposeful, coordinated. The silver-haired man's jaw tightened. He issued another series of hand signals, and the operators instantly adjusted their positions, two moving toward the ramp entrance while another took up a post near the wall-mounted controls. The Black Hawk outside remained on the ground, its rotors idling, as if waiting for a signal to either lift off or take on more cargo. Marissa's instincts screamed that they were standing at the edge of something, either an extraction or a confrontation. Every detail around her sharpened in her mind. The hum of the machinery now active, the metallic tang of gun oil in the air, the subtle vibration of the floor from the helicopter's presence. She caught the woman in the green jacket glancing at her briefly, as if gauging whether Marissa understood the stakes. The look wasn't one of reassurance. It was a silent warning. Then, without any further hesitation, the silver-haired man gave the signal. The machinery, now fully assembled, began to emit a low, steady pulse of sound, accompanied by a faint blue glow along its edges. Operators tightened their formation, the technicians stepped back, and the woman in the green jacket moved to stand near the ramp, her hand resting lightly on the sidearm at her hip. The shapes on the camera feeds were drawing closer, their outlines becoming more defined, too organized to be random passersby. As the tension in the bay reached its breaking point, the helicopter's side door slammed shut with finality. Its rotors began to spin faster, the noise ramping back up into a roaring crescendo, and Marissa realized with a jolt that whatever happened next, the Black Hawk would not be staying grounded much longer.
The roar of the Black Hawk's rotors was now a constant, pressing weight against every ear in the bay, the kind of sound that rattled teeth and made words useless unless shouted. Outside, the wind turned in chaotic gusts, sending scraps of paper and fine dust spiraling upward before vanishing into the night. The silver-haired man didn't waste time with explanations. His movements were crisp, his signals sharp, each one relayed instantly through the operators who now formed a solid wall between the ramp and whatever approached from the perimeter. Marissa stood just inside the threshold, the blast of air from the helicopter whipping her hair across her face, her eyes locked on the shifting shapes at the edge of the lot. As they drew nearer, their forms took on definition. Men clad in mismatched tactical gear, their steps coordinated but less precise than the disciplined movements of the incoming team. There was no insignia on their clothing, no identifiers beyond the dark scarves pulled up over their faces, but the way they moved suggested experience, enough to make them dangerous. One of the forward operators raised a hand, palm flat, in a silent command to hold position. His rifle was steady, his body a steady and coiled readiness. The silver-haired man's gaze flicked between the encroaching figures and the newly assembled machine in the bay. The blue glow along its edges pulsed more rapidly now, the low hum vibrating through the floor. It wasn't loud enough to compete with the helicopter, but its presence was undeniable, like the thrum of an enormous heart beating somewhere deep within the walls. The woman in the green jacket stepped to Marissa's side without looking at her, her eyes locked forward. Her voice was a sharp whisper against the chaos, almost lost to the wind, telling Marissa to keep her head low and stay behind the machinery if things went bad. Marissa didn't argue. Something about the set of the woman's jaw, the tension in her shoulders, told her this wasn't bluster. Outside, the standoff was breaking. The shadowed figures reached the edge of the lot, hesitating for only a moment before fanning out in a rough semicircle. Their weapons were visible now, a mix of rifles and short-barreled shotguns, and while their gear lacked the polish of a professional unit, there was an unmistakable lethality in how they carried it. The lead operator shifted his stance, bringing his rifle up in a smooth, practiced motion, but he didn't fire. Neither side seemed ready to make the first move, as if some unspoken line had yet to be crossed. The air between them felt like it could snap at the slightest provocation. The silver-haired man raised his arm and made a single, deliberate gesture toward the Black Hawk. The side hatch slid open again, and one of the operators inside stepped out, hefting a cylindrical device about the size of a small duffel bag. He carried it to the base of the ramp, set it down with care, and gave a curt nod. The hum from the machinery inside the bay deepened, its tone dropping to a resonant vibration that seemed to anchor itself in Marissa's chest. Whatever was happening, it wasn't simply about defending the facility. This was preparation for something larger. One of the men in the mismatched gear took a step forward, lifting his hands slightly in a show that was neither surrender nor aggression. His voice carried faintly over the wind, but the words were lost in the roar.
The lead operator on the defending side didn't waver, his stance unshakable. In the next instant, the silver-haired man made a decision. He tapped the comm unit in his ear, and the helicopter's engine note surged higher, the rotors slicing the air with renewed force. The ground seemed to tremble beneath the combined energy of the Black Hawk and the machine in the bay. From somewhere deep in the device, the blue light flared bright enough to paint the walls in shifting shades of cyan, each pulse syncing perfectly with the deepening hum. The encroaching group stiffened at the sight, some exchanging wary glances, others tightening their grips on their weapons. For a brief second, it seemed they might pull back, but then a single figure among them raised a rifle and leveled it toward the bay. The sound of the shot was almost swallowed by the chaos, but the spark against the steel doorframe told Marissa exactly what had happened. That was all it took. The operators in the defensive line moved in perfect unison, their weapons coming to life in short, controlled bursts. Muzzle flashes flared bright against the night, illuminating faces twisted in focus and determination. The helicopter's door guns swiveled outward, unleashing a thundering barrage that tore through the far edge of the lot, forcing the attackers to scatter. The wind carried the acrid sting of gunpowder back into the bay, mingling with the heavy scent of fuel and hot metal. Marissa ducked low behind the machinery, her heartbeat pounding so hard she felt it in her throat. Through the chaos, she caught sight of the silver-haired man standing firm, his posture unyielding, as though this was exactly the moment he'd been expecting. The woman in the green jacket had drawn her sidearm, taking a position at the corner of the machinery where she could cover both the bay's interior and the ramp. She wasn't just watching for the attackers. Her eyes darted to the machine, to the operators working its controls even amid the firefight. The hum reached a peak, the blue light surging so brightly it seemed to bleach all color from the room. And then, with a sudden, almost violent jolt, the machine shifted into a new rhythm, one that felt like a countdown. The Black Hawk's rotors thundered overhead, the defensive perimeter held its ground, and the attackers scrambled to regroup. But Marissa's attention was fixed on that pulse, steady and inevitable, as though the entire night had been building toward whatever was about to happen next. The change, when it came, was not gradual. One moment the firefight raged on, sharp bursts of gunfire cutting through the thrum of the helicopter, and the next, the entire bay was drowned in a surge of light so intense it forced every unshielded eye to squeeze shut. The pulse from the machine had been building, but this was no mere escalation. It was as if all the stored energy it had been hoarding suddenly erupted outward in a perfect sphere of radiance that washed across the parking lot, the air, and even the bodies of those present. Marissa felt it as heat, but not burning, more like a shock wave of sunlight pressing against her skin, carrying with it an undercurrent of static that raised every hair on her arms. The attackers faltered instantly, some dropping to their knees, others stumbling back as their weapons clattered to the ground. There was no sound to this wave, no explosion, but the silence it left in its wake was almost worse. The helicopter still roared overhead, yet for several seconds, Marissa's ears refused to register it, as though the pulse had stunned more than just her body. The silver-haired man didn't flinch. In fact, his posture seemed to settle into something almost commanding, as though this display was a language only he spoke fluently. His hand lifted again in that precise, economical way, and the operators moved forward without hesitation, closing the distance between themselves and the stunned assailants. They moved with the assurance of those who knew the enemy's fight had been broken before it had even begun again. The woman in the green jacket swept her gaze over the lot, her sidearm ready but unused now, assessing the attackers' ability to recover. Marissa caught sight of their faces in the harsh wash of the bay's lighting, not the hardened expressions of soldiers in the thick of battle, but the wide-eyed confusion of men who had been confronted with something far outside the bounds of their understanding. The hum from the machine did not stop, but it had shifted again, lower now, more controlled, no longer building toward another burst. Whatever purpose the surge had served, it had been enough to break the momentum of the attack. Marissa dared to rise from her cover, her fingers brushing the cold metal of the machinery for balance. The blue light still pulsed faintly along its surface, tracing those strange, deliberate patterns, but the overwhelming glare had subsided. Outside, the operators were corralling the attackers, moving them toward the far corner of the lot, where two armored vehicles had been waiting in darkness until now. Headlights flared to life, stark and white, cutting through the wind-blown haze, and the subdued figures were ushered into the backs of the vehicles one by one. The silver-haired man watched this with the focus of a conductor, ensuring the final notes of a symphony landed exactly where they should. Only when the last of the attackers was secured did he turn toward the Black Hawk, gesturing sharply to its crew. The helicopter began to ease down in power, the rotor wash lessening just enough for voices to be heard again without the strain of shouting. The woman in the green jacket stepped forward then, her boots crunching on the grit scattered across the concrete. She spoke to the silver-haired man in quick, clipped tones, the words indistinct to Marissa but clearly urgent. He nodded once, twice, and then turned his gaze directly toward her. For a heartbeat, Marissa felt pinned by that look, as though he could see every thought racing through her head. But instead of the interrogation she half expected, he simply inclined his head slightly, an acknowledgement more than a greeting, and then looked back to the machine. Two of the operators were already working its controls, hands moving with practiced familiarity over its panel. A series of faint chimes sounded, almost musical, almost out of place in this scene, and then the blue light dimmed further until it was little more than a trace, like embers cooling after a long burn. The hum faded with it, leaving behind an almost eerie stillness. The helicopter's engine noise became the dominant sound again, but it was less oppressive now, no longer masking the subtler noises of the lot, the shuffle of boots, the creak of strained metal, the distant hiss of wind through the surrounding structures. Marissa's pulse was still racing, her body caught between the relief of the danger having passed and the sharp edge of knowing she still had no idea what she had just witnessed. The silver-haired man gave one last order, and the machine's panel went dark entirely. 4 of the operators moved to secure it with heavy tarps and reinforced straps, as though even dormant, it was something to be protected at all costs. The Black Hawk's side hatch swung wider, and a loading platform extended toward the bay. The operators guided the machine onto it with meticulous care, their movements steady and synchronized despite the exhaustion etched on their faces. As it was drawn into the helicopter's cargo hold, Marissa realized that whatever had just happened here was already being packed away, vanishing into the night sky before she could even begin to make sense of it. The woman in the green jacket lingered a moment longer, her attention fixed on Marissa. There was something in her expression, not quite suspicion, not quite reassurance, that made Marissa's chest tighten. It was as if the woman was silently warning her that some doors, once glimpsed through, were better left closed. And yet the warning came too late. Marissa knew she would never unsee what had unfolded here, and no amount of careful secrecy or official silence would make her stop wondering. As the Black Hawk lifted once more, its blades cutting into the night, she watched the dark shape rise and turn away, carrying with it the machine, the operators, and every answer she wasn't going to get. The lot seemed suddenly vast and empty without them. The remnants of the confrontation were already being swallowed by the quiet. But somewhere deep inside, she felt the certainty that this wasn't an ending at all. It was only the pause before something much bigger. Marissa stood in the empty parking lot long after the last trace of the Black Hawk's rotor wash had faded into the darkness, the silence pressing in with an almost physical weight. The faint smell of jet fuel and scorched asphalt lingered in the air, a reminder that what she had just seen was no dream, no exaggerated story she could dismiss. The attackers were gone, the strange machine was gone, and with them went the small team who had moved with the precision of people who had done this 100 times before. But the impression they left was indelible, stamped into her memory in sharp detail. She could still see the flash of the silver-haired man's eyes, the sharp, assessing intelligence there, the way he had moved as if every variable in this chaotic scene was under his control. She could still hear the soft, strangely melodic chimes of the machine as it powered down, a sound that seemed at odds with the danger it represented moments before. Her mind kept replaying the moment the attackers had faltered under that blinding surge of light, how an entire group of armed men had been reduced to confusion and submission in seconds. She knew now that she had witnessed something most people would never even hear whispered about, and she doubted she would ever be able to fully explain it to anyone who wasn't standing here beside her. When she finally turned toward the restaurant, she found the windows still empty, the inside stripped of the earlier bustle of customers. Somewhere in a kitchen a pot clattered, a sign that someone was tentatively returning to normal operations, but the building still seemed muted, as though it too was trying to process what had happened. The manager who had caused all this trouble by throwing her out earlier was nowhere to be seen. Perhaps he had fled when the situation escalated beyond his ability to control it, or perhaps he was hiding inside, hoping no one would remember his role in the humiliation that had started it all. Marissa doubted he would be eager to look her in the eye now, not after a military unit had shown up seemingly for her sake. That thought alone was surreal, the idea that people like the ones she had just seen would intervene so decisively in the life of someone like her, someone who had been sleeping in her truck only hours earlier. She stepped back toward her old pickup, its paint chipped and dull under the lot's harsh lighting. It looked almost out of place after what had just unfolded, a relic from a quieter life parked in the shadow of an event that felt like it belonged to a world of covert operations and military secrets. She ran her hand along the side, feeling the familiar roughness of the metal, grounding herself in its reality.
There was no way to explain the connection she had felt during those brief moments when the operators had looked at her. Not suspicion, not pity, but recognition, as if they knew her in some way she couldn't yet name. She had been a medic once, long ago, in places where the dust and heat clung to your lungs and the line between life and death was measured in seconds. She thought she had left that life behind, burying it under years of distance and obscurity, but tonight had pulled it all back to the surface in ways she wasn't prepared for. The hum of the machine, the precision of the team, the absolute clarity in their movements, it all resonated with something deep in her, something she thought she had lost when she traded combat boots for anonymity. Now she wasn't so sure she'd stay hidden. A low rumble on the horizon drew her attention, and for a moment her breath caught, thinking the helicopter might be returning. But it was only a distant freight truck passing along the highway, its lights flashing briefly between the gaps in the buildings before disappearing again. She exhaled slowly, realizing she had been holding her breath without meaning to. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, its pitch rising and falling as it moved away from her, heading towards some other crisis in some other part of the city. She wondered how long it would be before word of what had happened here got out, if it ever did. It was possible no one beyond this lot would ever know, that the men who had come tonight would disappear back into whatever shadowed network they served, leaving nothing but questions behind. And maybe that was for the best. She slid into the driver's seat of her truck, the worn vinyl creaking under her weight. Her hands rested on the steering wheel for a long moment before she started the engine. The familiar rumble steadied her, a reminder that for now, her life was still hers to steer. But as she pulled out of the lot, she found her thoughts circling back to the machine, to the operators, and to the silver-haired man's unblinking gaze. She had the uneasy sense that this night was not an isolated event, but the opening of a door she hadn't meant to approach. And once a door like that was open, there was no closing it again. Somewhere, above the city's sleeping streets, a Black Hawk helicopter was flying away into the darkness, carrying secrets she had brushed against, but not yet grasped. Marissa didn't know if she wanted those answers, but she knew, with a certainty that settled deep into her bones, that they were going to find her again, whether she wanted them or not. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.